Well, welcome everybody to today's AMA, Ask Me Anything, here on Polyplexus. I am especially delighted, and Bruno, please make sure I pronounce your name correctly. Bruno Sanchez-Andrade Nuño. I get that close to right?
That was perfect. It is not an easy name. It's a Spanish name with this very long and full of ñes and accents. So good job, Laura.
It's beautiful and memorable. But people who have been following along on this multi-month, multi-part series of incubators called The Art and Science of Systems Thinking know that there's always a question or five about the role of AI and the future of AI and how AI is part of this equation. And so I'm especially delighted to have a global thinker, principal scientist at Microsoft AI for Earth, to have this conversation with us. And so we welcome your questions. Please type them into the discussion threads and we will see them and answer or address as many as we can. Oh, see, there's already one from Matt. Hi, Matt. Oh, there you go. So we'll get to that, but I'm going to launch in directly with you, Bruno. When I reached out to say, would you be willing to have this conversation with us? You said, I would love to. And I want to put it to you first. What is it that you would like to have people thinking about AI in terms of systems challenges?
Thank you, Laura. It's gonna ask me anything. Doesn't mean that I need to answer everything. Because I think it's with AI and system thinking, there's so many questions we should ask. And the answer to some of those questions we just don't know. There's a lot of implications of what the technology can do and maybe should or should not do, or how it can help us. And AI I believe, has a tremendous potential to help in a lot of ways, but also has a potential to harm. So that's why I think it's especially important to have these kind of conversations with as many people as possible and from as many backgrounds as possible. I am an expert in AI. I am an expert in astrophysics because that's my background, but I'm not an expert in many things. And when AI is localized in particular cultures, particular countries, particular religions, particular histories, we're going to need all of those people with their concerns and the potential to apply this AI. So it's an extremely wide topic. I have no idea where this will go, but I'm excited to think about and see if I can help answer those questions. I would say that in the context of applying AI and systems thinking, the framework that I have is not so much AI, meaning artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence. There is always going to be a human. There should always be a human on the loop, because AI, at the end of the day, is encoding what we tell them, even in unsupervised ways, when you don't need a human to tell every loop what things it's doing. We can talk about what that means. There's always a reflection of data of the real world and what we do on the kinds of data we gather, kind of pictures we gather, the kind of sounds we gather. There's always need to be someone close to the AI to guide it to the right places and guide it away from more harm places. So it's a general answer here. Let's go more into particulars if you want, Laura. If you have not only questions for me but also help me answer those, that would be great.
I have a lot of opinions. I am here to mingle with those who can write the equations and support my theories or disabuse me of my bad ideas. So a theme running through this set of incubators has been my challenge to the world of whose point of view do you want in your lifeboat, right? As I like to say, I'm pretty smart, I'm pretty resilient, and resourceful, but if everybody else in the boat thought exactly how I think, we'd better be right, right? Our chances just went down. And so I'm curious, do you feel like, or I'm not imbuing AI with personality, therefore not with opinions, but I see a future where there's a set of AIs that think very differently from each other, right? They've been programmed
Yes.
differently.
Yes.
Whether they were designed to solve a particular problem, but they think, process, problem solve, or can chew on a piece of a problem in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see there being a bona fide role for these distinct and known, separate, and maybe new, completely new ways of thinking that AI bring to things as complicated as, say, climate, right? Giant
Yes.
nested systems challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest dangers of AI, or one of the two biggest dangers of AI, one is that it will always have biases of whatever data it's used on, or whoever created that AI. That already tells you that you're always gonna come with biases, and you need to be aware of the ones you know, and also try to expand always the kind of opinions gathered or the kind of people who are using it or thinking about using it, because you might realize that you had a bias you didn't know. And things as complicated and holistic and dependent as climate change is an example we can more go into details. The other danger of AI is that AI is very opinionated. It's very hard for an AI system to say I don't know. As long as an AI system picks up something, they will bias the answer to that something with high confidence. To try to make an example of that, imagine an AI system who is able to detect, I don't know, houses, doors, or dogs, or animals, or whatever thing it is. It's primed to detect features of the things that it needs to detect. So as soon as it detects something, it say, hey, this is a house, or this is a door, even though it might not be, because it just picked up those features. It's really hard for an AI to understand the concept of nothing, the concept of not. You cannot train something to say, hey, I have a class of cats, dogs, and not cats and dogs. It's really hard to class the negative class. So that means an AI system will tend to be as soon as it's barely possible to have a strong opinion. And that is also another danger, because it's often useful, and it's a human thing we should do even ourselves more often, to say, I don't know, or I need more data. And AI systems tend to be opinionated. So these biases and opinionated tendencies of AI systems, it tells you that you should always try to find counterfactuals. You should try to find people to see the edges of the systems, to have different opinions, who comes from completely different perspectives. Or, as I mentioned before, and I'm very opinionated on this, is that we cannot lead with AI. We cannot lead with data. We should be informed by it, but we should also be informed by other factors like history, or localization, or culture, or religion, or morals, or diplomacy, or economy. There are many factors that should be on the table alongside an AI. An AI would be extremely useful, but rarely is the only ingredient for a right answer.
So how do we get past the black box aspect of AI and the fact that the AI that people like you are building will outlive you?
Well, I would say that the idea of a black box is a bit disappearing. We know more how things work, and we're able to peek into that black box. It's still really complicated.
We used to know how the pyramids work, and we've forgotten. Will we forget
Sure.
how this was built?
That's an interesting question. I would say two things. For AI systems we're using today, we are getting better and better at understanding how they work. So we'll know how they work. Having said that, there is new advances that AI creates its own AI systems.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, it might be really hard to understand how that works, because it was not an architecture defined by a person, so it might be really hard for us to understand. Can it get a point where we cannot understand how the AI system works? Yes. But I hope that we'll always have tests and we'll always have limits. And as I said before, there should always be like a sandbox or where this should be applied, or an awareness of those biases, or where we are entering in a terrain that we should be more critical or more doubtful, even though the AI is very opinionated.
Can you see a need and a plausible future where there's some version of AI regulation that specifically, so if I wanted to sign up for a calculus class, whatever organization, I mean, maybe not with the internet now, but would want me to take a set of prerequisites so that I didn't waste time in the calculus class without those prerequisites. Can you see there being some sort of required baseline of human context and knowledge for rounding out that bias, rounding errors around bias based on the source for AI?
You mean for an AI system?
Yeah.
That an AI system should have some prerequisites?
Yeah, so if Bruno is designing something and Bruno's going to bring all of his goodwill but bias to that, but it's AI at a certain level, and so powers that be say, you know what, send your AI to this boot camp that expose it to.
I think yes. I think it would be a good idea to have regulations around that. There should always be some, for example, explainability. Like we should always ask for, especially for things that obviously they can't define life or death, like I don't know, your freedom or your liberties, like should you go to jail or not, or should you get this loan or not. If you use AI assistants, that we should probably use them because it's a good idea to understand very complex things. I think it's a good idea to also say, hey, there should always be an explainability to the AI, to ask the AI, hey, how did you come up with this? Or tests we can run on that. Hey, we know these cases should go in this way. Let's run the AI and see if the system is biased or is doing a prejudice that is shouldn't, or is doing causality of correlation that is shouldn't. Like, for example, if some particular minority is being affected by the AI system, for the mere fact of being a minority, that should be something we should be able to test and consider.
At the top, you touched on one of my favorite themes, which is trying to provoke this community and others out there to put research into AI human calibration for specific problems. So my pet dream is for there to be an AI human super reference librarian, right? Because I think reference librarians are like the most wonderful example of broad and deep adjacent possibility generators that no search engine comes close to yet.
Yes, and I agree.
If there is a way to have the human collective supported by AI and understanding what the eyedropper is, right? What's this? Do you know of any specific? There's humans building AI and checking in and monitoring AI, but are you aware of research very specifically into what is the right mix and when for the best outcomes around a particular challenge, whether that's the stock market or medicine?
I know there is more and more concern on the ethics on AI and the biases on AI, and there's more and more people who are being trained. And again, to your question before that, the people that should be trained in this AI system is probably not the prototypical AI expert, like someone who comes, like, for example, computer science. And again, there are a lot of things AI can do that, like, technically can do, but there are a lot of things maybe we should consider if we should do that. And for that, people like historians or librarians, philosophers, but also expert subjects matters, like if it's in medicine, doctors, if it's in, I don't know, biologists or conservation scientists. Like, for example, in the work that I'm doing right now at Microsoft with AI for Earth and conservation and sustainability, it's not only about AI, it's also people who know AI, but also people who know about sustainability. We need both things, and both things are really hard. And I would even say that those who tend to know a lot about AI tend not to know a lot about the subject. be it conservation or be in socioeconomic development or others. And those who know about those topics tend not to know what AI. That's why when you start to combine these processes, which is the thing we are doing exactly, to lower the barrier to bring experts from one field and bring experts from AI, that's where we significantly can get to breakthroughs. Because again, it's not just about the data, it's not just about the AI, it's also about the other things that a librarian or a philosopher or all these other fields should be combined to create this. The true value, the true potential of AI is there. It's not on going to the extremes of what technically or academically computer science can bring us to AI. I don't think that is the right approach. It's actually a very dangerous approach because you are unleashing raw power without thinking where it might lead.
Isn't it inevitable that that raw power is going to be unleashed? I mean, maybe not by you, maybe not by Microsoft, but by somebody.
It is, but I would say the same for any tool that humanity has ever created, from a hammer to nail, to guns, to weapons, to science itself, to mathematics itself. We should be stewards of our creations, but I think we should not shy away from the benefit it can create. We should also know how it can be misused and figure out how to minimize that danger. But true, it's like AI is a tool, as any tool can be used for good or for harm.
So there's a question from Matt Mihalik. Is there anything different about how Microsoft conceptualizes system sciences or system science? There's specific
I cannot speak for the whole of Microsoft, but I know they have a lot of divisions from not only from there's a big Microsoft research, does a lot of academic research on that. There is a lot of, as all the technology companies, Microsoft is fully on board the AI revolution, and it can be useful for many things. So I would say that the way Microsoft uses this different to others, I wouldn't know the answer to that, but I would say that I would pride our company to have a strong research arm, but also product arm, and also environmental sustainability arm. So I would say that we're trying to figure that out, how to contribute to the ecosystems of the stakeholders where they are. This is something, for example, in our team do a lot. Again, it's not about just finding the solution ourselves and just putting out there, is to really talk with all the stakeholders, all who participate in a particular area and this ecosystem, and then figure out together how we can empower them to do more and empower ourselves to do more.
Can you? I'd love to hear more about the mindset and the actual construction of the AI for Earth project. And so the mindset, what it is, and then how will it play well with others? How will it play with the other efforts around? Right?
Yeah, happy to do so. So I should also preface that saying that I've been working on AI before in things like the World Bank, when I was working on big data for socioeconomic development, and before that doing some consulting in other cases, now with Microsoft. And I mentioned that because even though now the application is more on environmental sustainability, this method or the way we are approaching that, I think could and should be applied to many other areas. Like, even though I'm focusing more on environmental sustainability, there's applications in medical, in humanitarian response, in socioeconomic development again, or poverty eradication, a lot of these things. And I mentioned quickly the AI for Earth, but I didn't say what it is. So thank you, Laura, for giving me the space to explain quickly what it is. Happy to give as many details as possible. So AI for Earth is a program from Microsoft that has been running for already a few years, whose goal is to empower those working on environmental sustainability. Think climate change, think agriculture, think water, think problems with waste, think of, it's very encompassing. And places with weak environmental ecosystems tend to have weak socioeconomic systems. So it also connects to other areas. Like, we can all think of places that have like problems with climate change will impact the wealth and health of the people, and places where the wealth and health of the people are bad tend to also have poor ecosystems and poor environmental sustainability. So the AI for Earth program aims to help all of these stakeholders do their work better. What does that mean? It means, as I mentioned before, people who tend to know about AI or cloud tend not to know about environmental sustainability, and the opposite. So the program puts those bubbles together, makes the Venn diagram as big as possible, helping people with grants, helping people with making their code better, with hosting the data, and to bring forward all of this knowledge creation to realize this potential, but also with the mindset that it's not only about knowledge creation, it's also to apply all of these benefits. And this is in general. I'm speaking now in general. It's not only about, for example, in climate change or other issues, it's not only about understanding the issues, it's on how do you apply it operationally to achieve the impact that you want to see, the positive impact. It's not about knowing where are the elephants in the world and how are they decreasing, or the mangroves or the forest. It's then figuring out, what can we do about it? Can we use the same tools we used to figure that out with AI to say, hey, okay, now governments of the world, cities of the world, companies of the world, NGOs of the world, okay, let's use that knowledge creation and apply it to then realize the objectives. Like there's a lot of objectives for 2030. 2030 is only 9 years away. We need to get our act together to then realize this potential. And that's exactly what the AI for Earth team is doing. And specifically, the last thing we are working on since a year ago is building a planetary computer, which aims to do exactly that, to upgrade our efforts. It's not just grants, it's not just tools and just data, but also build a planetary computer that anyone can use to do exactly that, to operationalize the knowledge creation that we need for environmental sustainability.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? I'm picturing me typing in, what's the right intervention?
That would be great, right?
How does that work?
How do I solve climate change?
Exactly.
That would be great. So okay, the way I think about it is, let's think about this research and this knowledge creation and this knowledge application. So the first side of the equation is to understand climate change, to understand where the impacts are coming from, to understand what is the forecast of the impacts. And what we need to do is to make that better, faster, and more applied to particular places. And we know how to do that. That's technology, that's AI. Okay, let's work on making those processes and making all those algorithms faster to run, and so we can do scenarios and we can do all those things. Now, when we have this first half of the equation done and we are working on that, let's work on the second one, which is the harder one. I would argue the easy part is to do the climate change models. The easy part is to do the ecosystem accounting, which is not easy at all, but kind of know where the direction, how to make those things better. Then the question is, how do we apply that for impact? And in that, our hypothesis, or the hypothesis that I think the impact will happen, is to understand then who are the stakeholders on that particular region, on that particular area. Is it a city level? Is it a city issue? Is that a regional issue? Is it a national issue? Is it a company who has assets? Imagine, I don't know, for example, a hotel chain which has all their assets in the coast, or the Navy, and say, hey, I would love to know what is the impact it's going to have in the coast. How can I protect myself? Oh, if I put mangroves here, if I plant these things, or if I protect the nature, it will protect my own assets, but also it would give me some benefits. And integrating that knowledge, for example, in that case, helping those companies understand what they depend on and how to protect that, is when we go from this knowledge creation to knowledge utilization. And that's the thing in particular that the planetary computer is aiming to do, or is poised to do, is to help make the knowledge creation faster, make difficult things easier, but then also to bringing that to operations and help those stakeholders make decisions to then realize that impact. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. You mentioned earlier that a hard problem in AI is knowing what to do with what's not there, right? Not a cat or a dog.
Yeah.
One of the things that I struggle with, both in human data mapping and AI-assisted data mapping, and then looking at that collaboration down the road, is how to, in systems like your climate models, or like the research assemblage side, how to know what you haven't found yet. So, like, for example, the UN has made a beautiful data portal UN for Women. And my first reaction to this gorgeous portal was, you're showing me what you have. You're not calling out to the world for help with what you already know you don't have.
Yeah.
How can we, where's the future of that in AI for it to self-diagnose the gaps in its data?
Yeah, is to quote the Rumsfeld unknown unknowns, right? We have known unknowns, with no things we don't know, and that's the easy one in that sense. I mean, it could be hard or expensive to get the data we need to do that, but we know where the limits are, and that's the easy one. Okay, well, let's be careful in these cases, in those cases. For the ones we don't know, it's really a problem, especially if we apply the AI systems. If we construct first and then apply those in areas we don't know are a problem. And that's why, to your question in the beginning, a really good way to uncover those unknown unknowns is to speak with as variety and as diverse group of stakeholders or people or users or people affected by these AI systems as possible. It's extremely important, because I would argue it's one way we can uncover some aspects of these unknowns. At the end of the day, there are many we will never know. There are some mathematical methods to try to estimate those things like principal components or unexplained variance, or all of these things, and tell us, hey, there is a signal here we cannot really understand. Let's try to figure out if it's something that can at least correlate with the thing we cannot explain. So there are some ways to estimate the things we don't know, but it is a problem. It is something that, and again, as I was mentioning before, AI systems tend to be opinionated. So we need to be careful of those. I know this is not a full answer, but I said that before, you can ask me anything, but I might not have the answers to all of them.
Well, so one of the things I asked was in the AI for Earth, and particularly, let's just stick with climate, because it's a word that represents so many things and people get it. How will this effort play well with other parallel supercomputer AI-based efforts, like what NVIDIA is doing with their climate quantum computing and NASA's climate wall, and I'm sure others attempting to be a part of this solution set?
It has to. Like, we are collaborating with many of those. I would argue that it's not about creating a completely new thing that only plays well with your own thing. It's about integrating the stakeholder communities. We make a lot of effort to identify the things, the tools that these communities are already using, and then helping that. It's not about replacing, but it's about upgrading. In fact, a lot of the planetary computer is based on, or most of planetary computer, if not all, is based on open source and open data for that reason. Because we need the power of the commons to lower the risks, as the ones we mentioned, but also to raise the potential. If you're already using a tool and we are helping make that tool better, then fantastic. That's great. It's gonna be a all of the above and everyone involved kind of situation to solve this crisis. I genuinely believe we can, and I genuinely believe it's not about creating a shiny new thing and replacing other approaches. Is to be able to integrate these tools. Again, it's integrating and supporting other efforts. It's assisted intelligence, I would say, not replacing artificial intelligence.
Do you see, so sort of tying together the idea of building into AI that it needs to explain itself, how it got to what it's doing, or there needs to, or a regular check-in with a range of humans, and to understand how it did or is doing what it's doing. Do you see a time when AI is teaching other AI?
Yeah, I mean, that's already happening. There is some techniques of AI, for example, generative adversarial networks, when one AI is teaching another AI to fool the first one, to generate like artsy images or things like that. So it's already happening that AIs teach AIs, or you just genetic algorithms where you just tell it, just do whatever you want and optimize this function. A lot of AI is basically about the the optimizing a function and finding the right function to optimize, like, size of the images if you are compressing an image, or answer yes or no in this long application questions. But I was getting offhand in the answer. So yes, I think the AI should be able to explain itself. Not only that, I think to the degree that it's possible, it should also tell where the data that it was trained comes from. Or at least you should, anyone who's using it should be able to say, hey, that AI system was trained of that data, which comes from this place. Not only because it should empower the all the users who have participated in creating that. Like, for example, there's a lot of effort, imagine, in corals, and we used to train an AI system to detect and protect the corals, and the communities and the users and the scientists who are doing the really painful effort to gather data in these regions should be not only recognized, but also when someone is using AI here to say, hey, this was trained, in the Polynesia, it was trained in Australia, maybe it doesn't work in the tropics in Puerto Rico. So those explaining itself and explaining the provenance of the data from which it has been created is going to be important. It also, I don't want to go because I don't know much about it, but it also poses a lot of questions of who holds the copyright of, like, if is an AI trained on a particular data set being responsible for having, does it carry over the licenses and copyrights of the data? I don't know, but those are very interesting questions that we should figure out.
Right, they're gonna become big, and both exposure to legal action and profits.
Yeah.
Soon, it's happening. In the idea of AI being a support partner in provoking critical thinking or additional inquiry, we've been dancing around how to shift perspectives for framing problems, and how humans' unique ability, maybe not unique to our knowledge, like our ability to form narratives, to tell ourselves stories, to do thought experiments and then try to figure things out, and to tell each other stories. And do you see what, where I'm going is what will AI develop its own narrative? Is it a narrative that, right, like how we can teach it to talk to us, but what will its voice be?
Is it a question like, would an AI system be creative?
I guess I don't see it as creative, but will because of the different constructs of different AIs, so your AI might explain or postulate differently than another AI. Like how
yeah,
yeah, where will it go with that?
Like, if I understand the question, is like, would the answer of an AI or different AIs be different explanations based on what AI it is? Would we have different explanations for the same reality or the same advice based on different AIs? I would say yes. I would say that an AI should be different AIs would be able to come to the same conclusion through completely different paths. And that's good. That's okay. I think that's also humans do. And again, AIs are really good at rationalizing or having an opinion. And the explainability of the systems says that, hey, we can pinpoint why, what kind of neurons inside this neural network, for example, or what part of the image is telling this AI that that thing is whatever, a car. Like, for example, if you have two AI systems, one is trained to recognize brands of cars, and the other one is trained to recognize, I don't know, the types of engines, and then the two of them recognize a car. One would explain it because of the brand of the car, and the other would explain it because of the engine that it saw. So I think that would be useful. If we are able to come up with different AIs that have different explanations, that would happen, and that probably is a good idea because it would lower the risk of those biases that I mentioned before, or being opinionated for a reason that it shouldn't be. If it's about creativity, which was the first part of the question, I think that AI can be creative There is Asimov wrote a small article of the origins of creativity or something like that. And he was, if I remember correctly, he was invited to participate in a session that was classified, and he refused because he said that he wouldn't know if he learned something that was classified, then he wouldn't be able to discern if it was because it was in that classified session, therefore he couldn't use it or not. But he did send this text, and in the text he says that how to maximize this creativity. And one of the sources of creativity is merging experts from different fields. That's something an AI can do. So that's why, to that degree, AIs can be genuinely creative. There are other sources of creativity that are probably more innate human. So maybe it's the creativity of AI is a particular kind, which is a good one. Like, it's fantastic if we're able to find, like humans do, things in, I don't know, astrophysics, which is my field, that could be applied for traffic jams. That's a type of AI, that type of creativity that AI can do. And if an AI can do it, then it's good.
I'm going to read out a question from Shelley. What is the potential impact of global ubiquitous AI on the planet's environmental ecosystem itself? We already see the impact of blockchain on energy consumption and global availability of processing hardware. Are there similar concerns about AI at global scale? Will it have an impact on energy consumption, rare mineral and resource mining, global supply chains for chips and hardware, and the related transportation impact on the environment?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
On the moon or floating around on space stations, what do we need to do to minimize that going forward?
It's a really good question, Shelly. Yes, Bitcoin is the example that a lot of people put. Bitcoin is consumes a lot of resources by design. The person or persons who created Bitcoin realized that one way to make the things align, all the incentives for a distributed transaction ledger, was to make it that many people need to make the same operation to basically mine the Bitcoins. We can go more into details, but basically it was a choice. Those creators said that it would be inefficient by design. It doesn't mean that it needs to be. In fact, in Ethereum, which is another cryptocurrency, there is now a push to change, instead of proof of computation, like doing all of this computation, there is something called proof of stake, where it should have less resources. The bottom line, I'm sorry if I went a little bit too technical, is that yes, in blockchain specifically, energy consumption is a big issue, because by design it's inefficient, and the more people use it, the more inefficient it is, which is funny. Or not, I mean, not funny, but it is how it is by design. And AI, because of the way it learns, it also needs a lot of resources. Training a network from scratch is like a zillion number of like small operations, and doing many times. It's something worth mentioning is that we should demystify AI. We should demystify that it's magic or is only at the hand of a few experts. We should make AI as easy to understand as possible. I might not be making a good job explaining what it is, but it is important to do that. And part of the reason is because, again, there might be academic incentives to train networks from scratch to do something new, but there is more and more emphasis in figuring out how to reduce this footprint. For example, learning transfers, where you use an AI to detect something, and it took a lot of time for the AI system to recognize to learn basic concepts. In case of images, for example, to recognize the concept of a corner, or the corner of, or the concept of an eye or a head. And if it was trained to do something very general, it is not difficult, and it takes way less time to shape that AI, put in a little bit of what's called layers at the end, and retrain it. Knowledge transfer or training transfer is one of the ways we can reduce a lot the energy consumption of AI. I would also say that the benefits of using AI, this is more a hypothesis or an opinion, it will be bigger than not doing it. The savings in your energy, like Google and others have done this in several efforts to optimize their air conditioning or their heating systems. The optimizations coming for the use of AI and energy savings using these systems, I would argue, are bigger than the energy costs to train those systems. This is maybe a point of contention to do that, but to summarize my answer to Sally is that yes, it is an issue. There is a potential high impact, and there are more and more initiatives to lower that impact. One of them is the retraining exercise, putting a lot of models out there that are already trained. This is happening more and more. You don't need to train from scratch to build an AI to do something. You should, in most cases, start from something that was already trained. So creating these global common assets of AI, like building bricks that you can then particularize to your particular location or language or images or whatever it is part of this. On the rare minerals resource mining, same thing. AI at the end of the day are computers, and they use rare materials, and if we do more and more of those, we're going to need more and more resources. So research to lower that resource constraints is going to be interesting. It's going to be useful. There are, as I mentioned, more and more efforts to lower the footprint. Microsoft, for example, has put data centers below water, which is a very good way to lower not only the energy consumption, but also to lengthen the life of the materials. If you put this basically in like a tube inside the water, that has proven to be not only a lot of energy savings, because water dissipates heat very well and doesn't have regional impact or something like that, because again, water dissipates heat very well, but it also makes the components last longer.
So Polyplexus is a global community of researchers and funders and policymakers. And what are there things, I mean, obviously you sit in an enviable position of directing a very science-based operation with a certain amount of resources, and yet you can't do everything. Your team can't do everything. What are things that you would particularly like to see researchers working on out there in the world, the hard problems that are part of this mosaic for all of us?
I would say that maybe we should focus on, I know it's not a dichotomy, but it's not about the hard problems, it's about the real problems. I would say science research in particular has an incentive to create new knowledge, to go to the edge cases, to the complicated ones, or to the less realistic ones, because reality sometimes often is very complicated. I would say that we need, maybe it's not a replacement, but a new kind of scientist that I've been calling impact scientists, which is the one who sits down with the policymaker, the one who sits down with the president or the mayor of a city, and then sits down and say, hey, we have this problem of, I don't know, employment. We have this problem of plastic pollution. We have this problem of heat island in the middle of the city. What can we do? And then using science and using research, obviously, but then using all the other things I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, like diplomacy or economics. Maybe you don't have the money to do that, or you cannot ban all the plastics because you happen to have a 20% of your people in the city work in the plastic factory. You cannot just close it. Science would say close the factory now, today, but the reality says if you do that, you're going to have a big problem of unemployment in that city. Obviously, we need to close it, but we need to figure out how. And this is what I like of what you mentioned of Polyplexus is we need to sit down together on the same table, those who have the problems like policymakers or the companies, those who have the skills to get the answers like the scientists and researchers, but also a whole array of other stakeholders like the neighbors or the others that are part of this ecosystem, and then together find the solution. It will never be just science, it will be a combination of many factors. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge we face today. It's not lack of data, We have more and more data. It's not lack of AI. We have more and more AI. It's not lack, maybe of resources. We seem to have more and more resources, especially for climate change or environmental sustainability. But then to go from that conceptualization and that knowledge creation to the application and to apply those things, it will not be only AI, it will be many other factors. That is the thing I would, and I have dedicated my life, my professional life, to do exactly that. I am trained as an astrophysicist, and I've worked in places like the World Bank. It makes no sense that someone who's a rocket scientist works at the World Bank, unless you have this mindset, which is how can we put science to work? In Microsoft, it's the same thing. I'm not there just to create AI system. I'm there to try to apply all of these new advantages, all of these new AI systems and technologies into the real world.
Could AI, so I love that, I agree. I think it's fair to say we've all watched well-intentioned, even my fantasy interdisciplinary teams come to the table, but then bogged down because of politics and human dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
Could AI possibly be the facilitator that takes that same interdisciplinary approach and keeps the ball moving in terms of rapid prototyping? Not beyond scenarios, right? Scenarios and models are good to a point, but at some point, particularly humans need to make things and need to make them together to get past a morass of ego and other things.
Yes, but at the end of the day, it's not. I think it's a good idea. I would say it's not a good idea if then an AI system replaces the decision making.
Keeping the ball moving.
That is a good idea, to keep the ball moving, to say, hey, if you do this, this will be the impact. If you do that, that will be the impact. If you don't do anything, this will be the impact, which often we forget that there is also an impact of not doing something. That's, for example, in climate change, we seem to push the ball forward because it's hard to do things. Well, it's harder not to do things. Yes, so that's always important. But with the hard limit that an AI should not be accountable at the end of the day of those decisions. An institution, preferably an institution we have been chosen democratically, should be the ones which is at the end of the day accountable and responsible for making those decisions.
There's a question from Michael Stopa. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, Michael. Regarding AI bias, are there not cases where humans, by overruling the results of AI algorithms, are in fact displaying their bias rather than the other way around?
True, yeah. That is also danger, Michael, that is true. And then the question is like, who was wrong or why was overruled? There will be cases where overruling an AI is needed for cases that AI is blind to, like, again, like moral reasons or religious reasons. Maybe the religion of that individual is not, doesn't align with what the AI asks him to do or not to do. And it's going to be hard to encode that into an AI system. We have biases. Anyone who says that we are unbiased, I think it's not saying the truth. We all have biases, and sometimes those biases are needed. But we should be mindful of those. There will be cases where overruling AI algorithms will show the bias, and it will be wrong to do that. I am not saying it's an end goal, but I would say that we're still far from the point, if we ever reach, that we should prefer the bias of an AI than the bias. Actually, no, not that I'm saying it. There are cases where it's clear that humans overruling an AI have ill intent. That is true. But the reality is really complex, and every country and every governance and government and all of this, there's such a Pandora's box on anything we do with AI. So yes, you are correct, Michael, that we are overruling AI. Well, maybe we shouldn't, but the opposite is also true. So it's a difficult answer.
So, Bruno, what are the most common misconceptions that you come up against? And I mean for this sort of audience, right? scientists and people at a certain level of research and math sophistication still have some misconceptions, or do they? What are you struggling against in that?
I would say that a misconception that is not useful is to think that AI is magical. Or a black box. I mean, some are more black box than others, but at the end of the day, an AI system is a system that has learned some patterns in the data it was given and can then infer something when new data is presented. That's it. And it is becoming easier and easier to learn AI, and it should become easier and easier to learn AI. So come to AI if you don't know with the right questions. It's also very important to know what question you're asking and what data do you have. So when you have these issues in your approach AI and you have to avoid these common misconceptions, is ask a ton of questions, even if you don't, especially if you don't know AI, to try to understand what it is. Know exactly the kind of data you have and the known biases of the data you have, and also know what is the thing that AI was told to do. An AI system will do exactly what is being told, not what you intend them to do, but exactly what you tell them. If you tweak the question slightly, it will tweak accordingly the answer. But it's often the case that we think we are asking an AI to do something, but actually the thing we are putting in the system is not what we intend 100%.
Okay, thank you. All right, from Luisa Schumacher, who are some of the voices in leading institutions to learn from as it relates to AI and systems change?
I will be biased to say that I follow very closely fast.ai, which is a group of people that are working to make AI as approachable as possible, to teach AI, and also to teach ethics or AI, and to have framework. I've come to appreciate that from many years ago, the work they are doing. So
fantastic. Okay, and another question from Fabian Pertui, I'm not sure. What do you think is the risk of AI mediated
I have no idea what it is.
I don't know what iatrogenics is.
Okay.
The possibility that humans will at some point try so hard to use AI to improve things, identify actionable solutions to high-stake questions.
Okay.
That could then degrade the situation. Do you see a way that AI are designed to say, stop, I'm not confident enough that any of my predictions are worth using, or should this always remain the responsibility of humans?
Iatrogenesis is the causation of a disease, a harmful complication, or ill effect by a medical activity, but including diagnosis, okay, an error or negligence. Okay, I think explain it. Thank you, Fabian. I think you explained the question, the word by that. Yes, and the risk will be higher when we need to make big decisions quickly with little data. This is the case, I think, in military applications happens a lot when you need to decide if to do something or not to do something based on a very small amount of information. I would say there are processes to try to, or principles, like in medicine, like for this word, the Hippocratic Oath, to try to do no harm, that should guide us in these cases. But yes, I think there will be cases where AI will be very well intended and it will have ill effect. And that there's a lot of cases with that happening, by the way. There is a really good book from a few years ago already called Weapons of Mass Destruction that talks about the bad consequences of well-intended AI systems. And the group that I mentioned before, Fast AI, has a free online course on data ethics and AI ethics that talks about many of these cases. Cases like, for example, using AI systems to predict future incidents of criminals that tends to bias based on if you're a minority or not, or there are many cases that are documented in this online course on Fast AI or this book of Weapons of Mass Destruction. And we are seeing more and more cases. So yes, that is already happening, and it is a big concern, but also something that is more and more the topic of more efforts to minimize this harm.
I think Fabian is also touching on what we culturally know and associate with AI, excuse me, such as HAL from 2001, right? When there is something that AI doesn't know, right? When the ship's computer in Star Trek says, I don't know, or I don't have enough information. I think he's also touching on, will we have such sophisticated AIs that we expect to be these oracles, that will have a built into them the ability maybe to, I don't know if he's asking it precisely that way, but to say, I'm not qualified. I don't have enough information, and I'm not constructed to form this hypothesis for you.
Yeah, we talk a little bit about that, yes. And there is this, what I mentioned, some AI systems have a tendency to be opinionated, but also we often forget that an AI system will only be as good as the data that it was trained on. So imagine you train, I don't know, an algorithm to detect images in Africa of settlements, and then you use it in Asia. And when you use it in Asia, very little algorithms would say, hey, the images that I'm looking at here are very different to the ones I'm used to look. Those kind of things are probably needed to do, probably need to happen more and more, and it's not happening enough. It's one of all those things, again, because have been led by what we can do versus how we should do it, that the technology has been progressing farther and faster than our capacity to assess how we should use it.
So on the issue of that the AI is only as good as the data it's trained on, in systems in particular, most systems or all systems eventually are dynamic. But data input into the AI beast isn't necessarily dynamic. How do we get around that?
That is true. It's hard to train an AI to have dynamic inputs of data. Mm-hmm. There's actually a thing called, I don't remember the technical name, but basically when you train an AI system on new data, it tends to forget a lot of the former knowledge. Like it degrades a lot. It doesn't have, like humans have, a prevalence of long-term memory. I genuinely think it's something we'll get better at it, but so far the efforts are not that good.
But isn't that a mission critical thing in climate, for example? Like just absolutely critical? As current and as
it is important, but because training happens so well, so fast, the alternative of learning a new data and then forgetting the past, if it becomes an issue, then you just train the whole thing again. It seems crazy that you have 10 more images, and then you had 1 million images, and you need to train for 1,010,000 images. Mm-hmm. But it's easier than it seems, than learning how to take into account 10 new images versus the million you had before.
Or do you have 10 AIs and they move in a sequence, or
It is, yeah, that's happening. An ensemble of AI systems is something that is often used partly for this reason. Like one AI is training this kind of data, one AI is training that kind of data, one AI is training of this other data, and then they basically propose an answer.
So, Bruno, if I can keep you for one more question, I know we're coming up against your hard out, but our mutual beloved friend, Max Kazin, she says, yeah, hi, Max. Thank you both for the excellent conversation. For policymakers and shareholder-steered leaders, making the case for upstream prevention is so tricky. At its most successful, the worst doesn't happen. AI seems to offer us the way to time travel and reveal the paths to sell the story. Bruno, are there any case studies where governments or big organizations have been using this kind of visible data storytelling to budget for early intervention? And then she's got PS, OpenAI's GPT-3 is astonishingly creative and generative, even if its downstream effects on business models and trust are bonkers.
I agree with that.
On weapons of mass destruction. So she's asking, I think the question to address is, AI seems to offer us a way to forecast time travel and reveal the most efficient, cost-effective path. for intervention?
Yeah, I see the point of Max, and I genuinely believe humans love stories. And when AI is able to narrate story or explain things, like AI is really good at explaining things. People love explanations and people love stories. And having an AI assistant to explain something, it's great. But let's always remember that an AI system can only work with the data the data that it has, and by definition, data does not include the future. So there's always limitations of that. And there are climate change is a great example where even though all that I said is true, that the past is not an example of the future, we do know the mechanisms to do that, and we can predict the future. So there are ways to tell these stories. There are ways to talk about, go around these issues, and I agree with Max that AI could be really powerful to sell a story. The word sell has a lot of baggage, because then are you selling something or you're presenting something? It's because you're selling something, you have a motive, and maybe it's a good motive, but it's a motive. So yeah, and the GPT-3 is absolutely amazing. I think we have not yet understood what it means. So I think it's also prompting questions to define what creativity is. As I mentioned before, I genuinely believe GPT-3 is creative in some ways, but it cannot be in others, like the Asimov reference of this article.
Bruno, this has been extraordinary and really helpful. Is there any, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to round out on, or anything we didn't on that you were itching to talk about?
I always wanted to thank Max, thank you, and thank the whole Polyplexus for doing this. It has been great. I do hope you had more questions, and I do have disagreements with me. If you do, please, of course, reach out. I love to. This all helps. Getting questions, especially hard questions, helps me a ton professionally and also personally to figure out how to go forward in the next steps. And as I mentioned before, the more people you talk to, the better. Diversity is a benefit in itself. And I hope by doing this session, I can help increase that.
What's the best way for people to reach out with those provocative nudges?
Twitter, for example, is a good one. Bruno San, that's my handle. But if you just search my name online, I'm very easy to find.
Easy to find, hard to reach. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the great questions, always, Polyplexus community, and thanks again, Bruno.